I had just learned that I'd won a place at Cambridge to study for a PhD when Mother wrote to me. "Grandma's in the hospital again," she said. "Come quick. I think this will be the last time." When I landed in Salt Lake, Grandma was drifting in and out of consciousness. Drew met me at the airport. We were more than friends by then, and Drew said he would drive me to Idaho, to the hospital in town. I hadn't been back there since I'd taken Sean years before, and as I walked down its white, antiseptic hallway, it was difficult not to think of him. We found Grandma's room. Grandpa was seated at her bedside, holding her speckled hand. Her eyes were open, and she looked at me. "It's my little Tara, come all the way from England," she said, then her eyes closed. Grandpa squeezed her hand, but she was asleep. A nurse told us she would likely sleep for hours. Drew said he would drive me to Bucks Peak. I agreed, and it wasn't until the mountain came into view that I wondered whether I'd made a mistake. Drew had heard my stories, but still there was a risk in bringing him here. This was not a story, and I doubted whether anyone would play the part one had written for them. The house was in chaos. There were women everywhere, some taking orders over the phone, others mixing oils or straining tinctures. There was a new annex on the south side of the house, where younger women were filling bottles and packaging orders for shipment. I left Drew in the living room and went to the bathroom, which was the only room in the house that still looked the way I remembered it. When I came out, I walked straight into a thin old woman with wiry hair and large, square glasses. "This bathroom is for senior management only," she said. "Bottle fillers must use the bathroom in the annex." "I don't work here," I said. She stared at me. "Of course I work here. Everyone worked here. This bathroom is for senior management," she repeated, straightening to her full height. "You're not allowed to leave the annex." She walked away before I could reply. I still hadn't seen either of my parents. I weaved my way back through the house and found Drew on the sofa, listening to a woman explain that aspirin can cause infertility. I grasped his hand and pulled him behind me, cutting a path through the strangers. "Is this place for real?" he said. I found Mother in a windowless room in the basement. I had the impression that she was hiding there. I introduced her to Drew, and she smiled warmly. "Where's Dad?" I said. I suspected that he was sick in bed, as he had been prone to pulmonary illnesses since the explosion had charred his lungs. "I'm sure he's in the fray," she said, rolling her eyes at the ceiling, which thrummed with the thudding of feet. Mother came with us upstairs. The moment she appeared on the landing, she was hailed by several of her employees with questions from clients. Everyone seemed to want her opinion about their burns, their heart tremors, their underweight infants. She waved them off and pressed forward. The impression she gave as she moved through her own house was of a celebrity in a crowded restaurant, trying not to be recognized. My father's desk was the size of a car. It was parked in the center of the chaos. He was on the phone, which he'd wedged between his cheek and shoulder so it wouldn't slip through his waxy hands. "Doctors can't help with them diabetes," he said, much too loudly. "But the Lord can." I looked sideways at Drew, who was smiling. Dad hung up and turned toward us. He greeted Drew with a large grin. He radiated energy, feeding off the general bedlam of the house. Drew said he was impressed with the business, and Dad seemed to grow 6 inches. "We've been blessed for doing the Lord's work," he said. The phone rang again. There were at least 3 employees tasked with answering it, but Dad leapt for the receiver as if he'd been waiting for an important call. I'd never seen him so full of life. "The power of God on earth," he shouted into the mouthpiece. "That's what these oils are, God's pharmacy." The noise in the house was disorienting, so I took Drew up the mountain. We strolled through fields of wild wheat, and from there into the skirt of pines at the mountain base. The fall colors were soothing, and we stayed for hours, gazing down at the quiet valley. It was late afternoon when we finally made our way back to the house, and Drew left for Salt Lake City. I entered the chapel through the French doors and was surprised by the silence. The house was empty, every phone disconnected, every workstation abandoned. Mother sat alone in the center of the room. "The hospital called," she said. "Grandma's gone." My father lost his appetite for the business. He started getting out of bed later and later, and when he did, it seemed it was only to insult or accuse. He shouted at Sean about the junkyard and lectured Mother about her management of the employees. He snapped at Audrey when she tried to make him lunch, and barked at me for typing too loudly. It was as if he wanted to fight, to punish himself for the old woman's death. Or perhaps the punishment was for her life, for the conflict that had been between them, which had only ended now she was dead. The house slowly filled again. The phones were reconnected, and women materialized to answer them. Dad's desk remained empty. He spent his days in bed, gazing up at the stucco ceiling. I brought him supper, as I had as a child, and wondered now, as I'd wondered then, whether he knew I was there. Mother moved about the house with the vitality of 10 people, mixing tinctures and essential oils, directing her employees between making funeral arrangements and cooking for every cousin and aunt who dropped in unannounced to reminisce about Grandma. As often as not, I'd find her in an apron, hovering over a roast with a phone in each hand, one a client, the other an uncle or friend calling to offer condolences. Through all this, my father remained in bed. Dad spoke at the funeral. His speech was a 20-minute sermon on God's promises to Abraham. He mentioned my grandmother twice. To strangers, it must have seemed he was hardly affected by the loss of his mother. But we knew better, we who could see the devastation. When we arrived home from the service, Dad was incensed that lunch wasn't ready. Mother scrambled to serve the stew she'd left to slow cook. But after the meal, Dad seemed equally frustrated by the dishes, which Mother hurriedly cleaned, and then by his grandchildren, who played noisily while Mother dashed about trying to hush them. That evening, when the house was empty and quiet, I listened from the living room as my parents argued in the kitchen. The least you could do, Mother said, is fill out these thank you cards. It was your mother, after all. That's wifely work, Dad said. I've never heard of a man writing cards. He had said the exact wrong thing. For 10 years, Mother had been the primary breadwinner, while continuing to cook meals, clean the house, do the laundry, and I had never once heard her express anything like resentment. Until now. Then you should do the husband's work, she said, her voice raised. Soon they were both shouting. Dad tried to corral her, to subdue her with a show of anger, the way he always had, but this only made her more stubborn. Eventually she tossed the cards on the table and said, fill them out or don't. But if you don't, no one will. Then she marched downstairs. Dad followed, and for an hour their shouts rose up through the floor. I never heard my parents shout like that. At least, not my mother. I never seen her refuse to give way. The next morning, I found Dad in the kitchen, dumping flour into a glue-like substance I assumed was supposed to be pancake batter. When he saw me, he dropped the flour and sat at the table. You're a woman, Ein Cha, he said. Well, this here's a kitchen. We stared at each other, and I contemplated the distance that had sprung up between us. How natural those words sounded to his ears, how grating to mine. It wasn't like Mother to leave Dad to make his own breakfast. I thought she might be ill and went downstairs to check on her. I'd barely made it to the landing when I heard it. Deep sobs coming from the bathroom, muffled by the steady drone of a blow-dryer. I stood outside the door and listened for more than a minute, paralyzed. Would she want me to leave, to pretend I hadn't heard? I waited for her to catch her breath, but her sobs only grew more desperate. I knocked. It's me, I said. The door opened, a sliver at first, then wider, and it was my mother, her skin glistening from the shower, wrapped in a towel that was too small to cover her. I had never seen my mother this way, and instinctively I closed my eyes. The world went black. I heard a thud, the cracking of plastic, and opened my eyes. Mother had dropped the blow-dryer and it had struck the floor. Its roar now doubled as it rebounded off the exposed concrete. I looked at her, and as I did, she pulled me to her and held me. The wet from her body seeped into my clothes, and I felt droplets slide from her hair and onto my shoulder. I didn't stay long on Buck's Peak, maybe a week. On the day I left the mountain, Audrey asked me not to go. I have no memory of the conversation, but I remember writing the journal entry about it. I wrote it my first night back in Cambridge, while sitting on a stone bridge and staring up at King's College Chapel. I remember the river, which was calm. I remember the slow drift of autumn, leaves resting on the glassy surface. I remember the scratch of my pen moving across the page, recounting in detail, for a full 8 pages, precisely what my sister had said. But the memory of her saying it is gone. It is as if I wrote in order to forget. Audrey asked me to stay. Sean was too strong, she said, too persuasive, for her to confront him alone. I told her she wasn't alone. She had Mother. Audrey said I didn't understand. No one had believed us after all. If we asked Dad for help, she was sure he'd call us both liars. I told her our parents had changed, and we should trust them. Then I boarded a plane and took myself 5,000 miles away. If I felt guilty to be documenting my sister's fears from such a safe distance, surrounded by grand libraries and ancient chapels, I gave only one indication of it, in the last line I wrote that night. Cambridge is less beautiful tonight. Drew had come with me to Cambridge, having been admitted to a master's program in Middle Eastern Studies. I told him about my conversation with Audrey. He was the first boyfriend in whom I confided about my family, really confided the truth and not just amusing anecdotes. Of course, all that is in the past, I said. My family is different now, but you should know, so you can watch me, in case I do something crazy. The first term passed in a flurry of dinners and late-night parties, punctuated by even later nights in the library. To qualify for a PhD, I had to produce a piece of original academic research. In other words, having spent 5 years reading history, I was now being asked to write it. But to write what? While reading for my master's thesis, I'd been surprised to discover echoes of Mormon theology in the great philosophers of the 19th century. I mentioned this to David Runciman, my supervisor. That's your project, he said. You can do something no one has done. You can examine Mormonism not just as a religious movement, but as an intellectual one. I began to reread the letters of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. As a child, I'd read those letters as an act of worship. Now I read them with different eyes, not the eyes of a critic, but also not the eyes of a disciple. I examined polygamy, not as a doctrine, but as a social policy. It felt like a radical act. My friends in Cambridge had become a kind of family, and I felt a sense of belonging with them that for many years had been absent on Buck's Peak. Sometimes I felt damned for those feelings. No natural sister should love a stranger more than a brother, I thought, and what sort of daughter prefers a teacher to her own father? But although I wished it were otherwise, I did not want to go home. I preferred the family I had chosen to the one I had been given. So the happier I became in Cambridge, the more my happiness was made fetid by my feeling that I had betrayed Buck's Peak. That feeling became a physical part of me, something I could taste on my tongue or smell on my own breath. I bought a ticket to Idaho for Christmas. The night before my flight, there was a feast in my college. One of my friends had formed a chamber choir that was to sing carols during dinner. The choir had been rehearsing for weeks, but on the day of the feast, the soprano fell ill with bronchitis. My phone rang late that afternoon. It was my friend. "Please tell me you know someone who can sing," he said. I had not sung for years, and never without my father to hear me. But a few hours later, I joined the chamber choir on a platform near the rafters, above the massive Christmas tree that dominated the hall. I treasured the moment, taking pleasure in the lightness I felt to have music once again floating up from my chest, and wondering whether Dad, if he were here, would have braved the university and all its socialism to hear me sing. I believed he would die. Buck's Peak was unchanged. The princess was buried in snow, but I could see the deep contours of her legs. Mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, stirring a stew with one hand and with the other holding the phone and explaining the properties of Motherword. Dad's desk was still empty. He was in the basement, Mother said, in bed. Something had hold of his lungs. A burly stranger shuffled through the back door. Several seconds passed before I recognized my brother. Luke's beard was so thick, he looked like one of his goats. His left eye was white and dead. He'd been shot in the face with a paintball gun a few months before. He crossed the room and clapped me on the back, and I stared into his remaining eye, looking for something familiar. But it wasn't until I saw the raised scar on his forearm, a curved check mark 2 inches wide for where the shear had bitten his flesh, that I was sure this man was my brother. Asterisk. He told me he was living with his wife and a pack of kids in a mobile home behind the barn, making his money working oil rigs in North Dakota. 2 days passed. Dad came upstairs every evening and settled himself into a sofa in the chapel, where he would cough and watch TV or read the Old Testament. I spent my days studying or helping Mother. On the third evening, I was at the kitchen table, reading, when Sean and Benjamin shuffled through the back door. Benjamin was telling Sean about a punch he'd thrown after a fender bender in town. He said that before climbing out of his truck to confront the other driver, he'd slipped his handgun into the waistband of his jeans. The guy didn't know what he was getting into, Benjamin said, grinning. "Only an idiot brings a gun into a mess like that," Sean said. "I wasn't going to use it," Benjamin muttered. "Then don't bring it," Sean said. "Then you know you won't use it. If you bring it, you might use it. That's how things are. A fist fight can turn into a gunfight real quick." Sean spoke calmly, thoughtfully. His blonde hair was filthy and uncut, growing wild, and his face was covered in stubble the color of shale. His eyes shone from under the oil and dirt, blazes of blue in clouds of ash. His expression, as well as his words, seemed to belong to a much older man, a man whose hot blood had cooled, who was at peace. Sean turned to me. I had been avoiding him, but suddenly that seemed unfair. He had changed. It was cruel to pretend he hadn't. He asked if I'd like to go for a drive, and I said I would. Sean wanted ice cream, so we got milkshakes. The conversation was calm, comfortable, like it had been years before on those dusky evenings in the corral. He told me about running the crew without Dad, about Peter's frail lungs, about the surgeries and the oxygen tubes he still wore at night. We were nearly home, only a mile from Buck's Peak, when Sean cranked the wheel and the car skidded on the ice. He accelerated through the spin, the tires caught, and the car leapt onto a side road. "Where are we going?" I asked, but the road only went one place. The church was dark, the parking lot deserted. Sean circled the lot, then parked near the main entrance. He switched off the ignition and the headlights faded. I could barely make out the curve of his face in the dark. "You talk much to Audrey?" he said. "Not really," I said. He seemed to relax. Then he said, "Audrey is a lying piece of shit." I looked away, fixing my eyes on the church spire, visible against the light from the stars. "I put a bullet in her head," Sean said, and I felt his body shift toward me. "But I don't want to waste a good bullet on a worthless bitch." It was crucial that I not look at him. As long as I kept my eyes on the spire, I almost believed he couldn't touch me. Almost, because even while I clung to this belief, I waited to feel his hands on my neck. I knew I would feel them, and soon, but I didn't dare do anything that might break the spell of waiting. In that moment, part of me believed, as I had always believed, that it would be me who broke the spell, who caused it to break. When the stillness shattered and his fury rushed at me, I would know that something I had done was the catalyst, the cause. There is hope in such a superstition, There is the illusion of control. I stayed still, without thought or motion. The ignition clicked, the engine growled to life. Warm air flooded through the vents. "You feel like a movie?" Sean said. His voice was casual. I watched the world revolve as the car spun around and lurched back to the highway. "A movie sounds just right," he said. I said nothing, unwilling to move or speak lest I offend the strange sorcery of physics that I still believed had saved me. Sean seemed unaware of my silence. He drove the last mile to Buck's Peak, chatting cheerfully, almost playfully, about whether to watch the man who knew too little or not. Asterisk, I remember this as the scar Luke got from working the shear. However, it might have come from a roofing accident. I didn't feel particularly brave as I approached my father in the chapel that night. I saw my role as reconnaissance. I was there to relay information, to tell Dad that Sean had threatened Audrey because Dad wouldn't know what to do. Or perhaps I was calm because I was not there. Not really. Maybe I was across an ocean, on another continent, reading Hume under a stone archway. Maybe I was racing through King's College, the discourse on inequality tucked under my arm. "Dad, I need to tell you something." I said that Sean had made a joke about shooting Audrey, and that I thought it was because Audrey had confronted him about his behavior. Dad stared at me, and the skin where his lips had been tightened. He shouted for Mother, and she appeared. Her mood was somber. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't look me in the eye. "What exactly are you saying?" Dad said. From that moment, it was an interrogation. Every time I suggested that Sean was violent or manipulative in any way, Dad shouted at me. "Where's your proof? Do you have proof?" "I have journals," I said. "Get them. I'm going to read them." "I don't have them with me." This was a lie. They were under my bed. "What the hell am I supposed to think if you ain't got proof?" Dad was still shouting. Mother sat on the sofa's edge, her mouth open in a slant. She looked in agony. "You don't need proof," I said quietly. "You've seen it. You've both seen it." Dad said I wouldn't be happy until Sean was rotting in prison, that I'd come back from Cambridge just to raise hell. I said I didn't want Sean in prison, but that some type of intervention was needed. I turned to Mother, waiting for her to add her voice to mine, but she was silent. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, as if Dad and I were not there. There was a moment when I realized she would not speak, that she would sit there and say nothing, that I was alone. I tried to calm Dad, but my voice trembled, cracked. Then I was wailing. Sobs erupted from somewhere, some part of me I had not felt in years, that I had forgotten existed. I thought I might vomit. I ran to the bathroom. I was shaking from my feet to my fingers. I had to strangle the sobs quickly. Dad would never take me seriously if I couldn't. So I stopped the bawling using the old methods, staring my face down in the mirror and scolding it for every tear. It was such a familiar process that in doing it, I shattered the illusion I'd been building so carefully for the past year. The fake past, the fake future, both gone. I stared at the reflection. The mirror was mesmeric, with its triple panels trimmed with false oak. It was the same mirror I'd gazed into as a child, then as a girl, then as a youth, half woman, half girl. Behind me was the same toilet Sean had put my head in, holding me there until I confessed I was a whore. I had often locked myself in this bathroom after Sean let me go. I would move the panels until they showed my face 3 times. Then I would glare at each one, contemplating what Sean had said and what he had made me say, until it all began to feel true, instead of just something I'd said to make the pain stop. And here I was still, and here was the mirror, the same face, repeated in the same 3 panels. Except it wasn't. This face was older, and floating above a soft cashmere sweater. But Dr. Carey was right. It wasn't the clothes that made this face, this woman, different. It was something behind her eyes, something in the set of her jaw, a hope or belief or conviction, that a life is not a thing unalterable. I don't have a word for what it was I saw, but I suppose it was something like faith. I had regained a fragile sense of calm, and I left the bathroom carrying that calmness delicately, as if it were a china plate balancing on my head. I walked slowly down the hall, taking small, even steps. "I'm going to bed," I said when I'd made it to the chapel. "We'll talk about this tomorrow." Dad was at his desk, holding a phone in his left hand. "We'll talk about it now," he said. "I told Sean what you said. He is coming." I considered making a run for it. Could I get to my car before Sean made it to the house? Where were the keys? "I need my laptop," I thought with my research. "Leave it," the girl from the mirror said. Dad told me to sit, and I did. I don't know how long I waited, paralyzed with indecision, but I was still wondering if there was time to escape when the French doors opened and Sean walked in. Suddenly the vast room felt tiny. I looked at my hands. I couldn't raise my eyes. I heard footsteps. Sean had crossed the room and was now sitting next to me on the sofa. He waited for me to look at him, and when I didn't, he reached out and took my hand. Gently, as if he were unfolding the petals of a rose, he peeled open my fingers and dropped something into them. I felt the cold of the blade before I saw it, and sensed the blood even before I glimpsed the red streak staining my palm. The knife was small, only 5 or 6 inches long and very thin. The blade glowed crimson. I rubbed my thumb and index finger together, then brought them to my nose and inhaled. Metallic. It was definitely blood. Not mine. He'd merely handed me the knife, but whose? If you're smart, Siddle Lister, Sean said, you'll use this on yourself. Because it will be better than what I'll do to you if you don't. That's uncalled for, Mother said. I gaped at Mother, then at Sean. I must have seemed like an idiot to them, but I couldn't grasp what was happening well enough to respond to it. I half wondered if I should return to the bathroom and climb through the mirror, then send out the other girl, the one who was 16. She could handle this, I thought. She would not be afraid, like I was. She would not be hurt, like I was. She was a thing of stone, with no fleshy tenderness. I did not yet understand that it was this fact of being tender, of having lived some years of a life that allowed tenderness, that would, finally, save me. I stared at the blade. Dad began a lecture, pausing often so Mother could ratify his remarks. I heard voices, among them my own, chanting harmonies in an ancient hall. I heard laughter, the slosh of wine being poured from a bottle, the tinkle of butter knives tapping porcelain. I heard little of my father's speech, but I remember exactly, as if it were happening now, being transported over an ocean and back through 3 sunsets, to the night I had sung with my friends in the chamber choir. I must have fallen asleep, I thought. Too much wine, too much Christmas turkey. Having decided I was dreaming, I did what one does in dreams. I tried to understand and use the rules of this queer reality. I reasoned with the strange shadows impersonating my family, and when reasoning failed, I lied. The imposters had bent reality. Now it was my turn. I told Sean I hadn't said anything to Dad. I said things like, I don't know how Dad got that idea, and Dad must have misheard me, hoping that if I rejected their percipients, they would simply dissipate. An hour later, when the 4 of us were still seated on the sofas, I finally came to terms with their physical persistence. They were here, and so was I. The blood on my hands had dried. The knife lay on the carpet, forgotten by everyone except me. I tried not to stare at it. Whose was the blood? I studied my brother. He had not cut himself. Dad had begun a new lecture, and this time I was present enough to hear it. He explained that little girls need to be instructed in how to behave appropriately around men, so as not to be too inviting. He noticed indecent habits in my sister's daughters, the oldest of whom was 6. Sean was calm. He had been worn down by the sheer duration of Dad's droning. More than that, he felt protected, justified, so that when the lecture finally ended, he said to me, I don't know what you said to Dad tonight, but I can tell just by looking at you that I've hurt you. And I'm sorry. We hugged. We laughed like we always did after a fight. I smiled at him like I'd always done, like she would have. But she wasn't there, and the smile was a fake. I went to my room and shut the door, quietly sliding the bolt, and called Drew. I was nearly incoherent with panic, but eventually he understood. He said I should leave, right now, and he'd meet me halfway. I can't, I said. At this moment, things are calm. If I try to run off in the middle of the night, I don't know what will happen. I went to bed, but not to sleep. I waited until 6 in the morning. Then I found Mother in the kitchen. I borrowed the car I was driving from Drew, so I told Mother something had come up unexpectedly, that Drew needed his car in Salt Lake. I said I'd be back in a day or 2. A few minutes later, I was driving down the hill. The highway was in sight when I saw something and stopped. It was a trailer where Sean lived with Emily and Peter. A few feet from the trailer, near the door, the snow was stained with blood. Something had died there. From Mother, I would later learn it was Diego, German Shepherd Sean had purchased a few years before. The dog had been a pet, much beloved by Peter. After Dad had called, Sean had stepped outside and slashed the dog to death, while his young son, only feet away, listened to the dog scream. Mother said the execution had nothing to do with me, that it had to be done because Diego was killing Luke's chickens. It was a coincidence, she said. I wanted to believe her, but didn't. Diego had been killing Luke's chickens for more than a year. Besides, Diego was a purebred. Sean had paid $500 for him. He could have been sold, but the real reason I didn't believe her was the knife. I'd seen my father and brothers put down dozens of dogs over the years, strays mostly, that wouldn't stay out of the chicken coop. I'd never seen anyone use a knife on a dog. We shot them in the head or the heart, so it was quick. But Sean chose a knife, and a knife whose blade was barely bigger than his thumb. It was the knife you'd choose to experience a slaughter, to feel the blood running down your hand the moment the heart stopped beating. It wasn't the knife of a farmer, or even of a butcher. It was a knife of rage. I don't know what happened in the days that followed. Even now, as I scrutinize the components of the confrontation, the threat, the denial, the lecture, the apology, it is difficult to relate them. When I considered it weeks later, it seemed I had made 1,000 mistakes, driven 1,000 knives into the heart of my own family. Only later did it occur to me that whatever damage was done that night might not have been done solely by me. And it was more than a year before I understood what should have been immediately apparent, that my mother had not confronted my father, and my father had not confronted Sean. Dad had never promised to help me and Audrey. Mother had lied. Now, when I reflect on my mother's words, remembering the way they appeared as if by magic on the screen, one detail stands above the rest. That mother described my father as bipolar. It was the exact disorder that I myself suspected. It was my word, not hers. Then I wonder if perhaps my mother, who had always reflected so perfectly the will of my father, had that night merely been reflecting mine. No, I tell myself, they were her words. But hers or not, those words, which had so comforted and healed me, were hollow. I don't believe they were faithless, but sincerity failed to give them substance, and they were swept away by other, stronger currents. I fled the mountain with my bags, half-packed, and did not retrieve anything that was left behind. I went to Salt Lake and spent the rest of the holidays with Drew. I tried to forget that night. For the first time in 15 years, I closed my journal and put it away. Journaling is contemplative, and I didn't want to contemplate anything. After the new year, I returned to Cambridge, but I withdrew from my friends. I had seen the earth tremble, felt the preliminary shock. Now, I waited for the seismic event that would transform the landscape. I knew how it would begin. Sean would think about what Dad had told him on the phone, and sooner or later he would realize that my denial, my claim that Dad had misunderstood me, was a lie. When he realized the truth, he would despise himself for perhaps an hour. Then he would transfer his loathing to me. It was early March when it happened. Sean sent me an email. It contained no greeting, no message whatsoever. Just a chapter from the Bible, from Matthew, with a single verse set apart in bold. O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? It froze my blood. Sean called an hour later. His tone was casual, and we talked for 20 minutes about Peter, about how his lungs were developing. Then he said, I have a decision to make, and I'd like your advice. Sure. I can't decide, he said. He paused, and I thought perhaps the connection had failed. Whether I should kill you myself or hire an assassin. There was a static-filled silence. It might be cheaper to hire someone when you figure in the cost of the flight. I pretended I hadn't understood, but this only made him aggressive. Now he was hurling insults, snarling. I tried to calm him, but it was pointless. We were seeing each other at long last. I hung up on him, but he called again and again and again, each time repeating the same lines, that I should watch my back, that his assassin was coming for me. I called my parents. He didn't mean it, Mother said. Anyway, he doesn't have that kind of money. Not the point, I said. Dad wanted evidence. You didn't record the call? He said. How am I supposed to know if he was serious? He sounded like he did when he threatened me with a bloody knife, I said. Well, he wasn't serious about that. Not the point, I said again. The phone call stopped, eventually, but not because of anything my parents did. They stopped when Sean cut me out of his life. He wrote, telling me to stay away from his wife and child, and to stay the hell away from him. The email was long, 1,000 words of accusation and bile, but by the end his tone was mournful. He said he loved his brothers, that they were the best men he knew. I loved you the best of all of them, he wrote, but you had a knife in my back the whole time. It had been years since I'd had a relationship with my brother, but the loss of it, even with months of foreknowledge, stunned me. My parents said he was justified in cutting me off. Dad said I was hysterical, that I'd thrown thoughtless accusations when it was obvious my memory couldn't be trusted. Mother said my rage was a real threat, and that Sean had a right to protect his family. Your anger that night, she told me on the phone, meaning the night Sean had killed Diego, was twice as dangerous as Sean has ever been. Reality became fluid. The ground gave way beneath my feet, dragging me downward, spinning fast, like sand rushing through a hole in the bottom of the universe. The next time we spoke, Mother told me that the knife had never been meant as a threat. Sean was trying to make you more comfortable, she said. He knew you'd be scared if you were holding a knife, so he gave it to you. A week later, she said there had never been any knife at all. Talking to you, she said, your reality is so warped. It's like talking to someone who wasn't even there. I agreed. It was exactly like that. I had a grant to study that summer in Paris. Drew came with me. Our flat was in the 6th arrondissement, near the Luxembourg Gardens. My life there was entirely new and as near to a cliché as I could make it. I was drawn to those parts of the city where one could find the most tourists, so I could throw myself into their center. It was a hectic form of forgetting, and I spent the summer in pursuit of it, of losing myself in swarms of travelers, allowing myself to be wiped clean of all personality and character, of all history. The more crass the attraction, the more I was drawn to it. I had been in Paris for several weeks when, one afternoon, returning from a French lesson, I stopped at a cafe to check my email. There was a message from my sister. My father had visited her. This I understood immediately, but I had to read the message several times before I understood what exactly had taken place. Our father had testified to her that Sean had been cleansed by the atonement of Christ, that he was a new man. Dad had warned Audrey that if she ever again brought up the past, it would destroy our entire family. It was God's will that Audrey and I forgive Sean, Dad said. If we did not, Ours would be the greater sin. I could easily imagine this meeting, the gravity of my father as he sat across from my sister, the reverence and power in his words. Audrey told Dad that she had accepted the power of the atonement long ago and had forgiven her brother. She said that I had provoked her, had stirred up anger in her, that I had betrayed her because I'd given myself over to fear, the realm of Satan, rather than walking in faith with God. I was dangerous, she said, because I was controlled by that fear and by the father of fear, Lucifer. That is how my sister ended her letter, by telling me I was not welcome in her home, or even to call her unless someone else was on the line to supervise, to keep her from succumbing to my influence. When I read this, I laughed out loud. The situation was perverse, but not without irony. A few months before, Audrey had said that Sean should be supervised around children. Now, after our efforts, the one who would be supervised was me. When I lost my sister, I lost my family. I knew my father would pay my brothers the same visit he'd paid her. Would they believe him? I thought they would. After all, Audrey would confirm it. My denials would be meaningless, the rantings of a stranger. I'd wandered too far, changed too much, bore too little resemblance to the scabby-kneed girl they remembered as their sister. There was little hope of overpowering the history my father and sister were creating for me. Their account would claim my brothers first, then it would spread to my aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole valley. I had lost an entire kinship, and for what? It was in this state of mind that I received another letter. I had one of visiting fellowship to Harvard. I don't think I have ever received the news with more indifference. I knew I should be drunk with gratitude that I, an ignorant girl who'd crawled out of scrap heap, should be allowed to study there, but I couldn't summon the fervor. I had begun to conceive of what my education might cost me, and I had begun to resent it. After I read Audrey's letter, the past shifted. It started with my memories of her. They transformed. When I recalled any part of our childhood together, moments of tenderness or humor, of the little girl who had been me with the little girl who had been her, the memory was immediately changed, blemished, turned to rot. The past became as ghastly as the present. The change was repeated with every member of my family. My memories of them became ominous, indicting. The female child in them, who had been me, stopped being a child and became something else, something threatening and ruthless, something that would consume them. This monster child stalked me for a month before I found a logic to banish her, that I was likely insane. If I was insane, everything could be made to make sense. If I was sane, nothing could. This logic seemed damning. It was also a relief. I was not evil. I was clinical. I began to defer, always, to the judgment of others. If Drew remembered something differently than I did, I would immediately concede the point. I began to rely on Drew to tell me the facts of our lives. I took pleasure in doubting myself about whether we'd seen a particular friend last week or the week before, or whether our favorite creperie was next to the library or the museum. Questioning these trivial facts, and my ability to grasp them, allowed me to doubt whether anything I remembered had happened at all. My journals were a problem. I knew that my memories were not memories only, that I had recorded them, that they existed in black and white. This meant that more than my memory was in error. The delusion was deeper, in the core of my mind, which invented in the very moment of occurrence, then recorded the fiction. In the month that followed, I lived the life of a lunatic. Seeing sunshine, I suspected rain. I felt a relentless desire to ask people to verify whether they were seeing what I was seeing. Is this book blue? I wanted to ask. Is that man tall? Sometimes this skepticism took the form of uncompromising certainty. There were days when the more I doubted my own sanity, the more violently I defended my own memories, my own truth, as the only truth possible. Sean was violent, dangerous, and my father was his protector. I couldn't bear to hear any other opinion on the subject. In those moments, I searched feverishly for a reason to think myself sane. Evidence. I craved it like air. I wrote to Erin, the woman Sean had dated before and after Sadie, who I hadn't seen since I was 16. I told her what I remembered and asked her, bluntly, if I was deranged. She replied immediately that I was not. To help me trust myself, she shared her memories of Sean screaming at her that she was a whore. My mind snagged on that word. I had not told her that that was my word. Erin told me another story. Once, when she had talked back to Sean, just a little, she said, as if her manners were on trial. He'd ripped her from her house and slammed her head against a brick wall so hard she'd thought he was going to kill her. His hands locked around her throat. I was lucky, she wrote. I had screamed before he began choking me, and my grandpa heard it and stopped him in time. But I know what I saw in his eyes. Her letter was like a handrail fixed to reality, one I could reach out and grasp when my mind began to spin. That is, until it occurred to me that she might be as crazy as I was. She was damaged, obviously, I told myself. How could I trust her account after what she'd been through? I could not give this woman credence because I, of all people, knew how crippling her psychological injuries were. So I continued searching for testimony from some other source. For years later, by pure chance, I would get it. While traveling in Utah for research, I would meet a young man who would bristle on my last name. Westover, he would say, his face darkening. Any relation to Sean? My brother. Well, the last time I saw your brother, he would say, emphasizing this last word as if he were spitting on it. He had both hands wrapped around my cousin's neck, and he was smashing her head into a brick wall. He would have killed her if it weren't for my grandfather. And there it was, a witness, an impartial account. But by the time I heard it, I no longer needed to hear it. The fever of self-doubt had broken long ago. That's not to say I trusted my memory absolutely, but I trusted it as much as I trusted anybody else's, and more than some people's. But that was years away. It was a sunny September afternoon when I heaved my suitcase through Harvard Yard. The colonial architecture felt foreign, but also crisp and unimposing compared to the Gothic pinnacles of Cambridge. The central library, called the Widener, was the largest I had ever seen, and for a few minutes I forgot the past year and stared up at it, wonderstruck. My room was in the graduate dorms near the law school. It was small and cave-like, dark, moist, frigid, with ashen walls and cold tiles the color of lead. I spent as little time in it as possible. The university seemed to offer a new beginning, and I intended to take it. I enrolled in every course I could squeeze into my schedule, from German idealism to the history of secularism to ethics and law. I joined a weekly study group to practice French and another to learn knitting. The graduate school offered a free course on charcoal sketching. I had never drawn in my life, but I signed up for that too. I began to read Hume, Rousseau, Smith, Godwin, Wollstonecraft, and Mill. I lost myself in the world they had lived in, the problems they had tried to solve. I became obsessed with their ideas about the family, with how a person ought to weigh their special obligations to kin against their obligations to society as a whole. Then I began to write, weaving the strands I'd found in Hume's Principles of Morals with filaments from Mill's The Subjection of Women. It was good work, I knew it even as I wrote it, and when I'd finished, I set it aside. It was the first chapter of my PhD. I returned from my sketching class one Saturday morning to find an email from my mother. "We're coming to Harvard," she said. I read that line at least 3 times, certain she was joking. My father did not travel. I'd never known him to go anywhere except Arizona to visit his mother, so the idea that he would fly across the country to see a daughter he believed taken by the devil seemed ludicrous. Then I understood. He was coming to save me. Mother said they had already booked their flights and would be staying in my dorm room. "Do you want a hotel?" I asked. They didn't cut. A few days later, I signed into an old chat program I hadn't used in years. There was a cheerful jingle and a name turned from gray to green. "Charles is online," it said. I'm not sure who started the chat or who suggested moving the conversation to the phone. We talked for an hour, and it was as if no time had passed. He asked where I was studying. When I answered, he said, "Harvard." Holy hell. Who would have thought? I said, "I did," he said, and it was true. He had always seen me like that, long before there was any reason to. I asked what he'd done after graduating from college, and there was a strained silence. "Things didn't go the way I planned," he said. He'd never graduated. He dropped out his sophomore year after his son was born because his wife was sick and there was a mound of medical bills. He'd signed on to work the oil rigs in Wyoming. It was only supposed to be for a few months, he said. That was a year ago. I told him about Sean, how I'd lost him, how I was losing the rest of my family. He listened quietly, then let out a long sigh and said, "Have you ever thought maybe you should just let them go?" I hadn't, not once. "It's not permanent," I said. "I can fix it." "Funny how you can change so much," Charles said, "but still sound the same as when we were 17. My parents arrived as the leaves began to turn, when campus was at its most beautiful, the reds and yellows of autumn mingling with the burgundy of colonial brick. With his hayseed grammar, denim shirt, and lifetime member NRA cap, Dad would have always been out of place at Harvard, but his scarring intensified the effect. I had seen him many times in the years since the explosion, but it wasn't until he came to Harvard and I saw him set against my life there that I realized how severely he disfigured himself. That awareness reached me through the eyes of others, strangers whose faces changed when he passed them in the street, who turned to get a second look. Then I would look at him, too, and notice how the skin on his chin was taut and plastic, how his lips lacked natural roundness, how his cheeks sucked inward at an angle that was almost skeletal. His right hand, which he often raised to point at some feature or other, was knotted and twisted, and when I gazed at it, set against Harvard's antediluvian steeples and columns, it seemed to me the claw of some mythical creature. Dad had little interest in the university, so I took him into the city. I taught him how to take the tee, how to feed his card through the slot, and push through the rotating gate. He laughed out loud, as if it were fabulous technology. A homeless man passed through a subway car and asked for $1. Dad gave him a crisp 50. "You keep that up in Boston, you won't have any money left," I said. "Doubt it," Dad said with a wink. "The business is rolling. We got more than we can spend." Because his health was fragile, my father took the bed. I had purchased an air mattress, which I gave to Mother. I slept on the tile floor. Both my parents snored loudly, and I lay awake all night. When the sun finally rose, I stayed on the floor, eyes closed, breathing slow, deep breaths while my parents ransacked my mini fridge and discussed me in hushed tones. "The Lord has commanded me to testify," Dad said. "She may yet be brought to the Lord." While they plotted how to reconvert me, I plotted how to let them. I was ready to yield, even if it meant an exorcism. A miracle would be useful. If I could stage a convincing rebirth, I could dissociate from everything I'd said and done in the last year. I could take it all back, blame Lucifer, and be given a clean slate. I imagined how esteemed I would be as a newly cleansed vessel. How loved. All I had to do was swap my memories for theirs, and I could have my family. My father wanted to visit the sacred grove in Palmyra, New York, the forest where, according to Joseph Smith, God had appeared and commanded him to found a true church. We rented a car, and 6 hours later entered Palmyra. Near the grove, off the highway, there was a shimmering temple topped by a golden statue of the angel Moroni. Dad pulled over and asked me to cross the temple grounds. "Touch the temple," he said. "Its power will cleanse you." I studied his face. His expression was stretched, earnest, desperate. With all that was in him, he was willing me to touch the temple and be saved. My father and I looked at the temple. He saw God, I saw granite. We looked at each other. He saw a woman damned. I saw an unhinged old man, literally disfigured by his beliefs, and yet triumphant. I remember the words of Sancho Panza. An adventuring knight is someone who's beaten and then finds himself emperor. When I reflect on that moment now, the image blurs, reconstituting itself into that of a zealous knight astride a steed, charging into an imaginary battle, striking at shadows, hacking into thin air. His jaw is set, his back straight. His eyes blaze with conviction, throwing sparks that burn where they lay. My mother gives me a pale, disbelieving look, but when he turns his gaze on her, they become of one mind. Then they are both tilting at windmills. I crossed the grounds and held my palm to the temple stone. I closed my eyes and tried to believe that this simple act could bring the miracle my parents prayed for. That all I had to do was touch this relic, and by the power of the Almighty, all would be put right. But I felt nothing, just cold rock. I returned to the car. "Let's go," I said. When life itself seems lunatic, who knows where madness lies? In the days that followed, I wrote that passage everywhere. Unconsciously, compulsively. I find it now in books I was reading, in my lecture notes, in the margins of my journal. Its recitation was a mantra. I willed myself to believe it, to believe there was no real difference between what I knew to be true and what I knew to be false. To convince myself that there was some dignity in what I planned to do, in surrendering my own perceptions of right and wrong, of reality, of sanity itself, to earn the love of my parents. For them, I believed I could don armor and charge at giants, even if I saw only windmills. We entered the sacred grove. I walked ahead and found a bench beneath a canopy of trees. It was a lovely wood, heavy with history. It was the reason my ancestors had come to America. A twig snapped. My parents appeared. They sat one on either side of me. My father spoke for 2 hours. He testified that he had beheld angels and demons. He had seen physical manifestations of evil and had been visited by the Lord Jesus Christ, like the prophets of old, like Joseph Smith had been in this very grove. His faith was no longer a faith, he said, but a perfect knowledge. "You have been taken by Lucifer," he whispered, his hand on my shoulder. I could feel at the moment I entered your room. I thought of my dorm room, of the murky walls and frigid tiles, but also of the sunflowers Drew had sent, and of the textile wall hanging a friend from Zimbabwe had brought from his village. Mother said nothing. She stared at the dirt, her eyes glossy, her lips pursed. Dad prodded me for a response. I searched myself, reaching deep, groping for the words he needed to hear. But they were not in me, not yet. Before we returned to Harvard, I convinced my parents to take a detour to Niagara Falls. The mood in the car was heavy, and at first I regretted having suggested the diversion. But the moment Dad saw the falls, he was transformed, elated. I had a camera. Dad had always hated cameras, but when he saw mine, his eyes shone with excitement. "Tara, Tara," he shouted, running ahead of me and Mother. "Get yourself a picture of this angle. Ain't that pretty?" It was as if he realized we were making a memory, something beautiful we might need later. Or perhaps I'm projecting, because that was how I felt. There are some photos from today that might help me forget the grove, I wrote in my journal. There's a picture of me and Dad happy, together. Proof that's possible. When we returned to Harvard, I offered to pay for a hotel. They refused to go. For a week, we stumbled over one another in my dorm room. Every morning, my father trudged up a flight of stairs to the communal shower in nothing but a small white towel. This would have humiliated me at BYU, but at Harvard I shrugged. I had transcended embarrassment. What did it matter who saw him, or what he said to them, or how shocked they were? It was his opinion I cared about. He was the one I was losing. Then it was their last night, and still I had not been reborn. Mother and I shuffled around the shared kitchen, making a beef and potato casserole, which we brought into the room on trays. My father studied his plate quietly, as if he were alone. Mother made a few observations about the food, then she laughed nervously and was silent. When we'd finished, Dad said he had a gift for me. "It's why I came," he said, "to offer you a priesthood blessing." In Mormonism, the priesthood is God's power to act on earth, to advise, to counsel, to heal the sick, and to cast out demons. It is given to men. This was the moment. If I accepted the blessing, he would cleanse me. He would lay his hands on my head and cast out the evil thing that had made me say what I had said, that had made me unwelcome in my own family. All I had to do was yield, and in 5 minutes it would be over. I heard myself say no. Dad gaped at me in disbelief. Then he began to testify, not about God, but about Mother. "The herbs," he said, "were a divine calling from the Lord. Everything that happened to our family, every injury, every near death, was because we had been chosen. We were special. God had orchestrated all of it so we could denounce the medical establishment and testify of his power." Remember when Luke burned his leg? Dad said, as if I could forget. That was the Lord's plan. It was a curriculum for your mother, so she would be ready for what would happen to me. The explosion, the burn. It was the highest of spiritual honors, he said, to be made a living testament of God's power. Dad held my hands in his mangled fingers and told me that his disfiguration had been foreordained, that it was a tender mercy, that it had brought souls to God. Mother added her testimony in low, reverent whispers. She said she could stop a stroke by adjusting a chakra, that she could halt heart attacks using only energy, that she could cure cancer if people had faith. She herself had had breast cancer, she said, and she had cured it. My head snapped up. "You have cancer?" I said. "You're sure? You had it tested." "I didn't need to have it tested," she said. "I muscle tested it. It was cancer. I cured it." "We could have cured Grandma too," Dad said. But she turned away from Christ. She lacked faith, and that's why she's dead. God won't heal the faithless. Mother nodded, but never looked up. "Grandma's sin was serious," Dad said. "But your sins are more serious still, because you were given the truth and have turned from it." The room was quiet except for the dull hum of traffic on Oxford Street. Dad's eyes were fixed on me. It was the gaze of a seer, of a holy oracle whose power and authority were drawn from the very universe. I wanted to meet it head-on, to prove I could withstand its weight, but after a few seconds something in me buckled, some inner force gave way, and my eyes dropped to the floor. "I'm called of God to testify that disaster lies ahead of you," Dad said. "It is coming soon, very soon, and it will break you utterly. It will knock you down into the depths of humility. And when you are there, when you are lying broken, you will call on the Divine Father for mercy." Dad's voice, which had risen to fever pitch, now fell to a murmur. "And he will not hear you." I met his gaze. He was burning with conviction. I could almost feel the heat rolling off him. He leaned forward so that his face was nearly touching mine and said, "But I will." The silence settled, undisturbed, oppressive. "I will offer one final time to give you a blessing," he said. The blessing was a mercy. He was offering me the same terms of surrender he had offered my sister. I imagined what a relief it must have been for her to realize she could trade her reality, the one she shared with me, for his. How grateful she must have felt to pay such a modest price. I could not judge her for her choice, but in that moment, I knew I could not choose it for myself. Everything I had worked for, all my years of study, had been a purchase for myself this one privilege, to see and experience more truths than those given to me by my father, and to use those truths to construct my own mind. I had come to believe that the ability to evaluate many ideas, many histories, many points of view, was at the heart of what it means to self-create. If I yielded now, I would lose more than an argument. I would lose custody of my own mind. This was the price I was being asked to pay. I understood that now. What my father wanted to cast from me wasn't a demon. It was me. Dad reached into his pocket and withdrew a vial of consecrated oil, which he placed in my palm. I studied it. This oil was the only thing needed to perform the ritual, that and the holy authority resting in my father's misshapen hands. I imagined my surrender, imagined closing my eyes and recanting my blasphemies. I imagined how I would describe my change, my divine transformation, what words of gratitude I would shout. The words were ready, fully formed and waiting to leave my lips. But when my mouth opened, they vanished. "I love you," I said. "But I can't." "I'm sorry, Dad." My father stood abruptly. He said again there was an evil presence in my room, that he couldn't stay another night. Their flight was not until morning, but Dad said it was better to sleep on a bench than with the devil. My mother bustled about the room, shoveling shirts and socks into their suitcase. 5 minutes later, they were gone. Someone was screaming a long, steady holler, so loud it woke me up. It was dark. There were streetlights, pavement, the rumble of distant cars. I was standing in the middle of Oxford Street, half a block from my dorm room. My feet were bare, and I was wearing a tank top and flannel pajama bottoms. It felt like people were gawking at me, but it was 2 in the morning and the street was empty. Somehow I got back into my building, then I sat on my bed and tried to reconstruct what had happened. I remembered going to sleep. I remembered the dream. What I did not remember was flying from my bed and sprinting down the hall and into the street, shouting, but that is what I had done. The dream had been of home. Dad had built a maze on Buck's Peak and trapped me inside it. The walls were 10 feet high and made of supplies from his root cellar, sacks of grain, cases of ammunition, drums of honey. I was searching for something precious I could never replace. I had to escape the maze to recover it, but I couldn't find the way out, and Dad was pursuing me, sealing the exits with sacks of grain stacked into barricades. I stopped going to my French group, then to my sketching class. Instead of reading in the library or attending lectures, I watched TV in my room, working my way through every popular series from the past 2 decades. When one episode ended, I would begin the next without thinking, the way one breath follows another. I watched TV 18 or 20 hours a day. When I slept, I dreamed of home, and at least once a week I awoke standing in the street in the middle of the night, wondering if it was my own cry that I'd heard just before waking. I did not study. I tried to read, but the sentences meant nothing. I needed them to mean nothing. I couldn't bear to string sentences into strands of thought, or to weave those strands into ideas. Ideas were too similar to reflection, and my reflections were always of the expression on my father's stretched face the moment before he'd fled from me. The thing about having a mental breakdown is that no matter how obvious it is that you're having one, it is somehow not obvious to you. I'm fine, you think. So what if I watched TV for 24 straight hours yesterday? I'm not falling apart. I'm just lazy. Why it's better to think yourself lazy than think yourself in distress? I'm not sure. But it was better. More than better. It was vital. By December, I was so far behind in my work that, pausing one night to begin a new episode of Breaking Bad, I realized that I might fail my PhD. I laughed maniacally for 10 minutes at this irony, that having sacrificed my family to my education, I might lose that also. After a few more weeks of this, I stumbled from my bed one night and decided that I'd made a mistake, that when my father had offered me the blessing, I should have accepted it. But it wasn't too late. I could repair the damage, put it right. I purchased a ticket to Idaho for Christmas. 2 days before the flight, I awoke in a cold sweat. I dreamed I was in a hospital, lying on crisp white sheets. Dad was at the foot of the gurney, telling a policeman I had stabbed myself. Mother echoed him, her eyes panicked. I was surprised to hear Drew's voice, shouting that I needed to be moved to another hospital. They'll find her here, he kept saying. I wrote to Drew, who was living in the Middle East. I told him I was going to Buck's Peak. When he replied, his tone was urgent and sharp, as if he was trying to cut through whatever fog I was living in. My dear Tara, he wrote, if Sean stabs you, you won't be taken to a hospital. You'll be put in the basement and given some lavender for the wound. He begged me not to go, saying 100 things I already knew and didn't care about. And when that didn't work, he said, you told me your story, so I could stop you if you ever did something crazy. Well, Tara, this is it. This is crazy. I can still fix this, I chanted as the plane lifted off the tarmac. It was a bright winter morning when I arrived on Buck's Peak. I remember the crisp smell of frozen earth as I approached the house and the feel of ice and gravel crunching beneath my boots. The sky was a shocking blue. I breathed in the welcome scent of pine. My gaze dropped below the mountain and my breath caught. When Grandma had been alive, she had, by nagging, shouting, and threats, kept my father's junkyard contained. Now refuse covered the farm and was creeping toward the mountain base. The rolling hills, once perfect lakes of snow, were dotted with mangled trucks and rusted septic tanks. Mother was ecstatic when I stepped through the door. I hadn't told her I was coming, hoping that, if no one knew, I might avoid Sean. She talked rapidly, nervously. I'm going to make you biscuits and gravy, she said, then flew to the kitchen. I'll help in a minute, I said. I just need to send an email. The family computer was in the old part of the house, would have been the front room before the renovation. I sat down to write Drew, because I'd promised, as a kind of compromise between us, that while on the mountain I would write to him every 2 hours. I nudged the mouse, and the screen flickered on. The browser was already open. Someone had forgotten to sign out. I moved to open a different browser, but stopped when I saw my name. It was in a message that was open on the screen, which Mother had sent only moments before. To Sean's ex-girlfriend Erin. The premise of the message was that Sean had been reborn, spiritually cleansed, that the atonement had healed our family, and that all had been restored. All except me. The Spirit has whispered to me the truth about my daughter, Mother wrote. My poor child has given herself over to fear, and that fear has made her desperate to validate her misperceptions. I do not know if she's a danger to our family, but I have reasons to think she might be. There was more to the email. In the final paragraph, Mother described the birth of Emily's second child, a daughter who had been born a month before. Mother had midwifed the child. The birth had taken place at home, and, according to Mother, Emily had nearly bled to death before they could get to a hospital. Mother finished the story by testifying. God had worked through her hands that night, she said. The birth was a testament of his power. I remember the drama of Peter's birth, how he'd slipped out of Emily weighing little more than a pound, how he'd been such a shocking shade of gray they'd thought he was dead, how they'd fought through a snowstorm to the hospital in town, only to be told it wasn't enough and there were no choppers flying, how 2 ambulances had been dispatched to McKay in Ogden, that a woman with this medical history, a woman so obviously high risk, should be advised to attempt a second birth at home seemed reckless to the point of delusion. If the first fall was God's will, whose was the second? I was still wondering at the birth of my niece when Erin's response appeared. You're right about Tara, she said. She is lost without faith. Erin told Mother that my doubting myself, my writing to her, Erin, to ask if I might be mistaken, if my memories might be false, was evidence that my soul was in jeopardy, that I couldn't be trusted. She is building her life on fear. I will pray for her. Erin ended the message by praising my mother's skill as a midwife. You are a true hero, she wrote. I closed the browser and stared at the wallpaper behind screen. It was the same floral print from my childhood. For how long had I been dreaming of seeing it? I had come to reclaim that life, to save it. But there was nothing here to save, nothing to grasp. There was only shifting sand, shifting loyalties, shifting histories. I remember the dream, the maze. I remember the walls made of grain sacks and ammunition boxes, of my father's fears and paranoias, his scriptures and prophecies. I had wanted to escape the maze with its disorienting switchbacks, its ever-modulating pathways, to find the precious thing. But now I understood. The precious thing, that was the maze. That's all that was left of the life I'd had here. A puzzle whose rules I would never understand, because they were not rules at all, but a kind of cage meant to enclose me. I could stay and search for what had been home, or I could go now before the walls shifted and the way out was shut. Mother was sliding biscuits into the oven when I entered the kitchen. I looked around, mentally searching the house. What do I need from this place? There was only one thing, my memories. I found them under my bed, in a box, where I had left them. I carried them to the car and put them in the back seat. I'm going for a drive, I told Mother. I tried to keep my voice smooth. I hugged her, then took a long look at Buck's Peak, memorizing every line and shadow. Mother had seen me take my journals to the car. She must have known what that meant, must have sensed the farewell in it, because she fetched my father. He gave me a stiff hug and said, I love you, you know that? I do, I said. That has never been the issue. Those words are the last I said to my father. I drove south. I didn't know where I was going. It was nearly Christmas. I had decided to go to the airport and board the next flight to Boston when Tyler called. I hadn't spoken to my brother in months. After what happened with Audrey, it had seemed pointless to confide in my siblings. I was sure Mother would have told every brother, cousin, aunt, and uncle the story she had told Erin, that I was possessed, dangerous, taken by the devil. I wasn't wrong. Mother had warned them. But then she made a mistake. After I left Buck's Peak, she panicked. She was afraid I might contact Tyler, and that if I did, he might sympathize with me. She decided to get to Tyler first, to deny anything I might tell him, but she miscalculated. She didn't stop to think how the denials would sound, coming from nowhere like that. Of course, Sean didn't stab Diego and threaten Tara with a knife. Mother reassured Tyler, but to Tyler, who had never heard any part of this story, not from me or anyone else, this was somewhat less than reassuring. A moment after he said goodbye to Mother, Tyler called me, demanding to know what had happened and why I hadn't come to him. I thought he'd say I was lying, but he didn't. He accepted almost immediately the reality I'd spent a year denying. I didn't understand why he was trusting me. But then he told me his own stories, and I remembered Sean had been his older brother, too. In the weeks that followed, Tyler began to test my parents in the subtle, non-confrontational way that was uniquely his. He suggested that perhaps the situation had been mishandled, that perhaps I was not possessed. Perhaps I was not evil at all. I might have taken comfort in Tyler's trying to help me, but the memory of my sister was too raw, and I didn't trust him. I knew that if Tyler confronted my parents, really confronted them, they would force him to choose between me and them, between me and the rest of the family. And from Audrey I had learned, he would not choose me. My fellowship at Harvard finished in the spring. I flew to the Middle East, where Drew was completing a Fulbright. It took some effort, but I managed to hide from Drew how poorly I was doing, or at least I thought I did. I probably didn't. He was, after all, the one chasing me through his flat when I awoke in the middle of the night, screaming and sprinting, with no idea where I was but a desperate need to escape it. We left Amman and drove south. We were in a Bedouin camp in the Jordanian desert on the day the Navy SEALs killed bin Laden. Drew spoke Arabic, and when the news broke, he spent hours in conversation with our guides. He's no Muslim, They told Drew as we sat on cold sand, watching the dying flames of campfire. He does not understand Islam, or he would not do the terrible things he's done. I watched Drew talk with the Bedouins, heard the strange, smooth sounds falling from his lips, and was struck by the implausibility of my presence there. When the Twin Towers had fallen 10 years before, I had never heard of Islam. Now I was drinking sugary tea with Zalabia Bedouins and squatting on a sand drift in Wadi Rum, the Valley of the Moon, less than 20 miles from the Saudi Arabian border. The distance, physical and mental, that had been traversed in the last decade nearly stopped my breath, and I wondered if perhaps I had changed too much. All my studying, reading, thinking, traveling, had it transformed me into someone who no longer belonged anywhere? I thought of the girl who, knowing nothing beyond her junkyard and her mountain, had stared at a screen, watching as two planes sailed into strange white pillars. Her classroom was a heap of junk. Her textbooks, slates of scrap. And yet she had something precious that I, despite all my opportunities, or maybe because of them, did not. I returned to England, where I continued to unravel. My first week back in Cambridge, I awoke nearly every night in the street, having run there, shouting, asleep. I developed headaches that lasted for days. My dentist said I was grinding my teeth. My skin broke out so severely that twice perfect strangers stopped me in the street and asked if I was having an allergic reaction. No, I said. I always look like this. One evening, I got into an argument with a friend about something trivial, and before I knew what was happening, I had pressed myself into the wall and was hugging my knees to my chest, trying to keep my heart from leaping out of my body. My friend rushed toward me to help, and I screamed. It was an hour before I could let her touch me, before I could will myself away from the wall. So that's a panic attack, I thought the next morning. Soon after, I sent a letter to my father. I'm not proud of that letter. It's full of rage, a fractious child screaming, "I hate you," at a parent. It's filled with words like thug and tyrant, and it goes on for pages, a torrent of frustration and abuse. That is how I told my parents I was cutting off contact with them. Between insults and fits of temper, I said I needed a year to heal myself. Then perhaps I could return to their mad world to try to make sense of it. My mother begged me to find another way. My father said nothing. Asterisk the italicized language in the description of the referenced email exchange is paraphrased, not directly quoted. The meaning has been preserved. I was failing my PhD. If I had explained to my supervisor, Dr. Runciman, why I was unable to work, he would have helped me, would have secured additional funding, petitioned the department for more time. But I didn't explain I couldn't. He had no idea why it had been nearly a year since I'd sent him work. So when we met in his office one overcast July afternoon, he suggested that I quit. The PhD is exceptionally demanding, he said. It's okay if you can't do it. I left his office full of fury at myself. I went to the library and gathered half a dozen books, which I lugged to my room and arranged on my desk. But my mind was made nauseous by rational thought, and by the next morning the books had moved to my bed, where they propped up my laptop while I worked steadily through Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That autumn, Tyler confronted my father. He talked to Mother first on the phone. He called me after and related their conversation. He said Mother was on our side, that she thought the situation with Sean was unacceptable and had convinced Dad to do something. Dad is taking care of it, Tyler said. Everything's going to be fine. You can come home. My phone rang again 2 days later, and I paused Buffy to answer it. It was Tyler. The whole thing had exploded in his face. He had felt uneasy after his conversation with Mother, so he had called Dad to see exactly what was being done about Sean. Dad had become angry, aggressive. He'd shouted at Tyler that if he brought this up again, he would be disowned. Then he'd hung up the phone. I dislike imagining this conversation. Tyler's stutter was always worse when he talked to our father. I picture my brother hunched over the receiver, trying to concentrate to push out the words that have jammed in his throat, while his father hurls an arsenal of ugly words. Tyler was still reeling from Dad's threat when his phone rang. He thought it was Dad calling to apologize, but it was Sean. Dad had told him everything. "I can have you out of this family in 2 minutes," Sean said. "You know I can do it. Just ask Tara." I listened to Tyler relate this story while staring at the frozen image of Sarah Michelle Gellar. Tyler talked for a long time, moving through the events quickly but lingering in a wasteland of rationalization and self-recrimination. Dad must have misunderstood, Tyler said. There had been a mistake, a miscommunication. Maybe it was his fault. Maybe he hadn't said the right thing in the right way. That was it. He had done this, and he could repair it. As I listened, I felt a strange sensation of distance that bordered on disinterestedness, as if my future with Tyler, this brother I had known and loved all my life, was a film I had already seen and knew the ending of. I knew the shape of this drama because I had lived it already with my sister. This was the moment I had lost Audrey. This was the moment the cost had become real when the tax was levied, the rent due. This was the moment she had realized how much easier it was to walk away. What a poor trade it was to swap an entire family for a single sister. So I knew even before it happened that Tyler would go the same way. I could hear his hand ringing through the long echo of the telephone. He was deciding what to do, but I knew something he did not, that the decision had already been made, and what he was doing now was just the long work of justifying it. It was October when I got the letter. It came in the form of a PDF attached to an email from Tyler and Stephanie. The message explained that the letter had been drafted carefully, thoughtfully, and that a copy would be sent to my parents. When I saw that, I knew what it meant. It meant Tyler was ready to denounce me, to say my father's words, that I was possessed, dangerous. The letter was a kind of voucher, a pass that would admit him back into the family. I couldn't get myself to open the attachment. Some instinct had seized my fingers. I remembered Tyler as he'd been when I was young, the quiet older brother reading his books while I lay under his desk, staring at his socks, and breathing in his music. I wasn't sure I could bear it, to hear those words in his voice. I clicked the mouse, the attachment opened. I was so far removed from myself that I read the entire letter without understanding it. Our parents are held down by chains of abuse, manipulation, and control. They see change as dangerous and will exile anyone who asks for it. This is a perverted idea of family loyalty. They claim faith, but this is not what the gospel teaches. Keep safe. We love you. From Tyler's wife, Stephanie. I would learn the story of this letter, how in the days after my father had threatened disownment, Tyler had gone to bed every night saying aloud to himself, over and over, "What am I supposed to do? She's my sister." When I heard this story, I made the only good decision I had made for months. I enrolled in the university counseling service. I was assigned to a sprightly, middle-aged woman with tight curls and sharp eyes, who rarely spoke in our sessions, preferring to let me talk it out, which I did, week after week, month after month. The counseling did nothing at first. I can't think of a single session I would describe as helpful, but their collective power over time was undeniable. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now, but there was something nourishing in setting aside that time each week in the act of admitting that I needed something I could not provide for myself. Tyler did send the letter to my parents, and once committed, he never wavered. That winter, I spent many hours on the phone with him and Stephanie, who became a sister to me. They were available whenever I needed to talk, and back then, I needed to talk quite a lot. Tyler paid a price for that letter, though the price is hard to define. He was not disowned, or at least his disownment was not permanent. Eventually, he worked out a truce with my father, but their relationship may never be the same. I've apologized to Tyler more times than I can count for what I've cost him, but the words are awkwardly placed, and I stumble over them. What is the proper arrangement of words? How do you craft an apology for weakening someone's ties to his father, to his family? Perhaps there aren't words for that. How do you thank a brother who refused to let you go, who seized your hand and wrenched you upward, just as you had decided to stop kicking and sink? There aren't words for that, either. Winter was long that year, the dreariness punctuated only by my weekly counseling sessions and the odd sense of loss, almost bereavement, I felt whenever I finished one TV series and had to find another. Then it was spring, then summer, and finally as summer turned to fall, I found I could read with focus. I could hold thoughts in my head besides anger and self-accusation. I returned to the chapter one had written nearly 2 years before Harvard. Again, I read Hume, Rousseau, Smith, Godwin, Wollstonecraft, and Mill. Again, I thought about the family. There was a puzzle in it, something unresolved. What is a person to do, I asked, when their obligations to their family conflict with other obligations to friends, to society, to themselves? I began to research. I narrowed the question, made it academic, specific. In the end, I chose 4 intellectual movements from the 19th century and examined how they had struggled with the question of family obligation. One of the movements I chose was 19th century Mormonism. I worked for a solid year, and at the end of it, I had a draft of my thesis, The Family, Morality, and Social Science in Anglo-American Cooperative Thought, 1813 to 1890. The chapter on Mormonism was my favorite. As a child in Sunday school, I'd been taught that all history was a preparation for Mormonism, that every event since the death of Christ had been fashioned by God to make possible the moment when Joseph Smith would kneel in the sacred grove and God would restore the one true church. Wars, migrations, natural disasters, these were mere preludes to the Mormon story. On the other hand, secular histories tended to overlook spiritual movements like Mormonism altogether. My dissertation gave a different shape to history, one that was neither Mormon nor anti-Mormon, neither spiritual nor profane. It didn't treat Mormonism as the objective of human history, but neither did it discount the contribution Mormonism had made in grappling with the questions of the age. Instead, it treated the Mormon ideology as a chapter in the larger human story. In my account, history did not set Mormons apart from the rest of the human family. It bound them to it. I sent Dr. Runciman the draft, and a few days later we met in his office. He sat across from me and, with a look of astonishment, said it was good. "Some parts of it are very good," he said. He was smiling now. "I'll be surprised if it doesn't earn a doctorate." As I walked home carrying the heavy manuscript, I remembered attending one of Dr. Carey's lectures, which he had begun by writing, "Who writes history?" on the blackboard. I remembered how strange the question had seemed to me then. My idea of a historian was not human. It was of someone like my father, more prophet than man, whose visions of the past, like those of the future, could not be questioned or even augmented. Now, as I passed through King's College, in the shadow of the enormous chapel, my old diffidence seemed almost funny. Who writes history? I thought. I do. On my 27th birthday, the birthday I had chosen, I submitted my PhD dissertation. The defense took place in December, in a small, simply furnished room. I passed and returned to London, where Drew had a job and we'd rented a flat. In January, nearly 10 years to the day since I'd set foot in my first classroom at BYU, I received confirmation from the University of Cambridge. I was Dr. Westover. I had built a new life, and it was a happy one, but I felt a sense of loss that went beyond family. I had lost Buck's Peak, not by leaving, but by leaving silently. I had retreated, fled across an ocean, and allowed my father to tell my story for me, to define me to everyone I had ever known. I had conceded too much ground, not just the mountain, but the entire province of our shared history. It was time to go home. It was spring when I arrived in the valley. I drove along the highway to the edge of town, then pulled over at the drop-off overlooking the Bear River. From there, I could look out over the basin, a patchwork of expectant fields stretching to Buck's Peak. The mountain was crisp with evergreens, which were luminous set against the browns and grays of shale and limestone. The princess was as bright as I'd ever seen her. She stood facing me, the valley between us, radiating permanence. The princess had been haunting me. From across the ocean, I'd heard her beckoning, as if I were a troublesome calf who'd wandered from her herd. Her voice had been gentle at first, coaxing, but when I didn't answer, when I stayed away, it had turned to fury. I had betrayed her. I imagined her face contorted with rage, her stance heavy and threatening. She had been living in my mind like this for years, a deity of contempt. But seeing her now, standing watch over her fields and pastures, I realized that I had misunderstood her. She was not angry with me for leaving, because leaving was a part of her cycle. Her role was not to corral the buffalo, not to gather and confine them by force. It was to celebrate their return. I backtracked a quarter mile into town and parked beside Graham over in town's white picket fence. In my mind, it was still her fence, even though she didn't live here anymore. She had been moved to a hospice facility near Main Street. I had not seen my grandparents in 3 years, not since my parents had begun telling the extended family that I was possessed. My grandparents loved their daughter. I was sure they had believed her account of me, so I had surrendered them. It was too late to reclaim Grandma. She was suffering from Alzheimer's and would not have known me. So I'd come to see my grandfather to find out whether there would be a place for me in his life. We sat in the living room. The carpet was the same crisp white from my childhood. The visit was short and polite. He talked about Grandma, whom he had cared for long after she ceased to recognize him. I talked about England. Grandpa mentioned my mother, and when he spoke of her, it was with the same look of awe that I had seen in the faces of her followers. I didn't blame him. From what I'd heard, my parents were powerful people in the valley. Mother was marketing her products as a spiritual alternative to Obamacare, and she was selling product as fast as she could make it, even with dozens of employees. God had to be behind such a wondrous success, Grandpa said. My parents must have been called by the Lord to do what they have done, to be great healers, to bring souls to God. I smiled and stood to go. He was the same gentle old man I remembered, but I was overwhelmed by the distance between us. I hugged him at the door and gave him a long look. He was 87. I doubted whether, in the years he had left, I would be able to prove to him that I was not what my father said I was, that I was not a wicked thing. Tyler and Stephanie lived 100 miles north of Buck's Peak, in Idaho Falls. It was there I planned to go next, but before leaving the valley, I wrote my mother. It was a short message. I said I was nearby and wanted her to meet me in town. I wasn't ready to see Dad, I said, but it had been years since I'd seen her face. Would she come? I waited for her reply in the parking lot at Stokes. I didn't wait long. It pains me that you think it is acceptable to ask this. A wife does not go where her husband is not welcome. I will not be party to such blatant disrespect. The message was long, and reading it made me tired, as if I'd run a great distance. The bulk of it was a lecture on loyalty, that families forgive, and that if I could not forgive mine, I would regret it for the rest of my life. The past, she wrote, whatever it was, ought to be shoveled 50 feet under and left to rot in the earth. Mother said I was welcome to come to the house, that she prayed for the day when I would run through the back door shouting, "I'm home." I wanted to answer her prayer. I was barely more than 10 miles from the mountain, but I knew what unspoken pact I would be making as I walked through that door. I could have my mother's love, but there were terms, the same terms they had offered me 3 years before, that I trade my reality for theirs, that I take my own understanding and bury it, leave it to rot in the earth. Mother's message amounted to an ultimatum. I could see her and my father, or I would never see her again. She has never recanted. The parking lot had filled while I was reading. I let her words settle, then started the engine and pulled onto Main Street. At the intersection, I turned west, toward the mountain. Before I left the valley, I would set eyes on my home. Over the years, I'd heard many rumors about my parents, that they were millionaires, that they were building a fortress on the mountain, that they had hidden away enough food to last decades. The most interesting by far were the stories about Dad hiring and firing employees. The valley had never recovered from the recession. People needed work. My parents were one of the largest employers in the county, but from what I could tell, Dad's mental state made it difficult for him to maintain employees long-term. When he had a fit of paranoia, he tended to fire people with little cause. Months before, he had fired Diane Hardy, Rob's ex-wife, the same Rob who'd come to fetch us after the second accident. Diane and Rob had been friends with my parents for 20 years, until Dad fired Diane. It was perhaps in another such fit of paranoia that Dad fired my mother's sister Angie. Angie had spoken to Mother, believing her sister would never treat family that way. When I was a child, it had been Mother's business. Now it was hers and Dad's together. But at this test of whose it was really, my father won. Angie was dismissed. It is difficult to piece together what happened next, but from what I later learned, Angie filed for unemployment benefits, and when the Department of Labor called my parents to confirm that she had been terminated, Dad lost what little reason remained to him. It was not the Department of Labor on the phone, he said, but the Department of Homeland Security pretending to be the Department of Labor. Angie had put his name on the terrorist watch list, he said. The government was after him now, after his money and his guns and his fuel. It was Ruby Ridge all over again. I pulled off the highway and onto the gravel, then stepped out of the car and gazed up at Buck's Peak. It was clear immediately that at least some of the rumors were true. For one, that my parents were making huge sums of money. The house was massive. The home I'd grown up in had 5 bedrooms. Now it had been expanded in all directions and looked as though it had at least 40. It would only be a matter of time, I thought, before Dad started using the money to prepare for the end of days. I imagined a roof lined with solar panels, laid out like a deck of cards. We need to be self-sufficient, I imagined Dad would say as he dragged the panels across his Titanic house. In the coming year, Dad would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars buying equipment and scouring the mountain for water. He didn't want to be dependent on the government, and he knew Buck's Peak must have water if he could only find it. Gashes the size of football fields would appear at the mountain base, leaving a desolation of broken roots and upturned trees where once there had been a forest. He was probably chanting, "Got to be self-reliant," the day he climbed into a crawler and tore into the fields of satin wheat.